Hello everyone, today we talk about the diplomatic machinations in the years before the siege of Vienna, and more specifically the ones concerning the resuming of a crusade project from the side of the papacy and of the Kingdom of Poland within this broader connection that we have always seen regarding Spain, France, Austria, and Constantinople, but also other players, the Italian states, Russia, and the Catholics and the Protestants in Germany. And this is essentially the years following the Peace of Nijmegen that had concluded the War of Devolution. So between France and the Netherlands, but that had also brought to some, anti-Spanish harassment by the side of the French navy against Messina. So there are many different interesting facets that are, very important also to understand in order to realize how, and we know it, how politics, how unpredictable really politics is, but at the same time how much efforts, of course, and intentions and objectives agitate within the same to make it that unpredictable. So after the Peace of Nijmegen, the Holy See kind of undertook at the purpose of creating a new Holy League against the Ottomans, a wide-range policy that included also difficult, but still at some point, already used approaches. For example, with Orthodox Russia or Shia Persia, for example. These contacts, as you know, were quite old, especially the one with Persia. Consider that between the Holy See and Persia, there were some members of the Dominican order that traditionally had in Iran a remarkable influence since the times of the Mongol Ilkhanate, right? And those, in fact, early machinations with the Mongols to eventually attack the Mamluks, the Ottomans, right? That had remained since, in fact, the late Middle Ages a viable diplomatic leverage, right, to exercise on that kind of, in fact, Asian front. As for Russia, there had been previous contacts, but it was more unusual because at the end of the day, the country had a much more defiled position in European affairs, and just at this point was emerging after especially the Peace of Shuravno that had been at the expenses of the eastern borders of Poland, right? And as we'll see now, Russia was at war with the Ottomans. Again, it wouldn't be a major player anyhow, but still, the papacy had always had this broader ecumenic mentality and capacity of, properly organizing massive political coordination intercontinentally speaking. We have seen also in other videos the enormous financial support given to, in fact, to the Catholic forces and the siege of Vienna. And without papal diplomacy, there is no historical doubt about this, but also historiographically, Vienna would have fallen, and there is no, again, that's certain. However, say in March 1679, a nourished series of papal letters insisted to the King of Poland, the Elector of Bavaria, and the King of Spain that time had come for the Sacra adversus Turcas expeditio, or the Bellum adversus Turcam, the Bellum Sacrum, the Sacra expeditio. So a tone and a lexicon that were the ones of a crusade, right? Consider that at this point, by the way, we mentioned the Elector of Bavaria, and this was Duke and Prince Elector of Bavaria Maximilian II, Emmanuel, 1662-1726. It was son of the Elector Ferdinand Mary, 1636-1679, and of Adelaide, that was in turn daughter of Victor Amadeus I, Duke of Savoy. And also in the series on Prince Eugene, we have partially seen how important this connection was between Bavaria and Savoy also for the Habsburgs later, and also during the same siege of Vienna. But here the words that the Pope used are quite eloquent. So the sacred, the holy expedition against the Turks, the war against the Turkey, fundamentally, the holy war, the holy expedition. We've seen in this series how alive at the time, and especially in these countries, let's say the northwestern Europe, in many ways was taking off towards different directions. Same Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, as well, their colonies had kind of already mental projections. But if you take Central Europe, Southern Europe, so the Habsburgs, Venice, right, the protagonists, and the same papacy, of course, and Poland as well, in Central Europe, of the struggle against the Ottoman Empire. Well, these are regions in Europe that kept a much closer, and in a way also a much more traditional view of the whole situation, not just because of the threat of the Ottomans, but generally also for the presence of the empire. Here Poland is a very crucial country. We have seen it also recently, in as much as it had already suffered the deluge. The Muscovy was pushing, as we've just said, on the eastern frontier with success. So the role of Poland here was to be revived in some way. That surely the victory of Jan Sobieski at the gates of Vienna against the Ottomans really provided in many ways, but still not saving the country eventually in the 18th century to become a Russian vassal at the end of the day. But still, these are years in which many cards could be played, and in fact, many different things could really happen. Right at this point, nobody even, as you'll see, the Ottomans had resumed a very kind of aggressive policy. At this point, they were fighting in Russia, and saying Poland was partially defiled, not to have Ottoman retaliation, but in general, it was evident that the Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa was he hated the Christians, first of all, right? He just sees as a political trait. He was about this resuming also properly the war in the European front. So the expedition of 1683 against the Habsburg, the Austrian capital, was unexpected in a way, but it was part, again, of a broader situation where mostly Catholic powers were aware of, and especially these ones on the fore against the same Ottomans. And as we will see, also France actually cared, because it was not just a pure kind of Turkish friend, right? You know, Louis XIV was playing their game to keep France, the hegemonic power that he had managed to create, but in the continent. But at the same time, there were interests of the French in the same Mediterranean to keep at bay the same Ottoman expansion, also the tumultuous Berber policies of North Africa quiet. Right? So this is all part of a broader picture that, again, I hope this series helps to highlight, especially as an example, right, to understand politics and strategy better, right, and so to bring people ever more distant from any kind of simplification, which doesn't absolutely mean to make any form of moral relativism, as unfortunately this is done today, right? The more ignorant people are, the more they do this, of course, because they know also other people are as ignorant. But history is the exact opposite of it. So it's sadly, to say something extremely unusual, even just to hear in today's world, because there's literally no one that even uses history functionally nowadays in any platform that can think of, any thinker, and it doesn't really happen, right? It just all tell to make some more broadly cheap simplification things that they fundamentally do not know. So of course I also don't know everything, as you understand, but they say that this space and time fascinated me a lot, because it made me understand, by studying this specific sources, how careful one must be with politics. and strategy, if even one wants even to be successful in the first place, which again has basically nothing to do with anything I see today from any single political side of the aisle, by far, by the way, without any hope. So, but I care to stress this. And it's just history, it's not me, right? I'm not special because of that. I also learn things from other people who wrote history, right? So it's just, I take my time to learn certain things. So this broader purpose of crusade, of course, had been, by a certain degree, ideal, right? Of course, this bigger proposal, the role of the Catholic Church, of course, was unique in its kind, and so there was some view there, was genuinely, as it's often forgotten in Catholic history, aimed at consolidating, reinforcing, and pacifying Christianity, and even the prevalent prejudices against Catholicism, Papism, whatever you want to call it, that really do not help to have a healthy historical awareness of any kind. In any case, this commitment, of course, also Central Europeans, also the Italians, the Poles, more on the four states, the ones who would suffer the most from further Ottoman expansionism, had other problems that were connected with the rest of Europe at that point, mostly France and all the so the struggle between Catholics and Lutherans and so on. So it was all intertwined. The 30 Years' War had finished just from essentially, in fact, 40 years, and many others had been fought ever since, with France also playing an ever more aggressive role, given the successfully accomplished containment of the Habsburg monarchy in Central Europe. So it was really a very harsh time. So, of course, this crusade project didn't, for all these letters that the Pope sent from his various powers, didn't immediately meet with any success, right? The attempts to reach to a formal intent, for example, between the Poles and the Russians, but also between the Habsburgs and the Russians, failed. Right, for many reasons that now we can't digress specifically on that, but you understand what was the problem. Nobody was happy, just like today, of Russian expansionism, as usual. But Louis XIV also played a role in this, because he limited himself to commit to intervene against Constantinople only in the case in which the Turks would have seriously, openly, and concretely threatened Poland or the Republic of Venice, right? So always remember here that even though the Sun King was was playing the Ottoman card all the time in anti-Habsburgic fashion, still there was a most Catholic role of France that was embodied splendidly by the same monarchy of Louis, and that had to do with the protection of these other Catholic powers, given that imperial power was quite not, in fact, as much as the French wanted, so there was a huge competition regarding these roles as well. But in this case, it's obvious what he was saying is that France would have not moved a finger unless the Ottomans would have literally invaded Poland or Venice, right? And Poland would have been more likely, it would have been more easier for the Ottomans to do so, and partly it had happened. Venice was a massive logistical gamble, to say the least, and something much less practicable, and also probably would have triggered a much bigger reaction in the West. In any case, that also Poland, with Jan Sobieski at this point, was still considered by Louis XIV kind of its own creation, right? As long as Sobieski had been elected. He was supported by the support of the French, right? And there was a very strong pro-French bias in among part of the Polish Szlachta, and this played in the broader Central European game of power. So, and it was in fact logic to expect from the Ottoman Empire, say, besides this, also very haughty and aggressive behavior of the Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa, that was, the perfect, like in this sense, the perfect Muslim that wants to resume the jihad and hates the Christians, but at the same time a very clever politician. And so he knew perfectly how to double play all the time, because everybody was doing it, of course. If, let's say, the Porte would have acted in a way of never attacking, if not like a Christian power at a time, in a way to play on the rivalries internal to Europe, right? So avoiding the triggering of conditions that determining a joint European interest to react would facilitate the creation of coalitions directed against her, against the Porte. So the Apostolic Nuncio in Vienna, Buonvisi, a very famous figure that we have met elsewhere, and about which there is a very important cartulary preserved at the State Archive of Lucca, together with Tommaso Talenti, who was a secretary of the same John III of Poland, right? And so it played very interestingly in this broader game, politically, diplomatically, was making, on the contrary, all the possible as a papal representative to support, to sustain the idea that, say, any attack of the Ottomans against a single Christian power was actually an attack to Christendom as a whole, right? And this is a very traditional, universal, and, consistent idea. And such argument was, had been often used by the Venetians, especially, right then. And now it was exploited fully by the same Holy Roman Imperial diplomacy that felt to be ever more on the fore, right, against the Ottomans, because, and we've seen it in other videos, it was not just the threat to, as it would happen, and that, it was thought by a certain degree not to be likely, even by the same Leopold the First, after a few time before, right, not realizing that the Ottomans were mounting up an expedition against the same Vienna. It was an enormous strategic and logistical feat of enormous cost and gamble as well. In fact, failed, but it was about to succeed at the same time. But there was the problem of the Protestant rebels in Hungary that was altogether, aside from the split between Royal Hungary, so under the Habsburgs, and Ottoman Hungary, and also this kind of more autonomous outskirts all around, what had belonged to Hungary at a point, of other countries that, generally speaking, supported the Ottomans, by the way, but were still Catholics, could infiltrate, and these were all regions, however, were close to the inheritance lands of the Austrian Habsburgs. And that caused always a lot of trouble. That were always carrying out guerrilla warfare against the imperial armies. We will see it in the end, because also the Habsburgic marshals were pretty harsh, and in a sense they were right, because they had to punish the guerrilla, and they had to dissuade the locals to receive support by the Ottomans. But that was constant, right? So whenever there was something happening in Hungary, you couldn't really know by which degree this was just like a distraction, or the Ottomans were planning something bigger in the region, right? And at the same time, the papal diplomacy and the same empire, of course, as we've seen, was worried and anxious relatively to the attitude of the Poles that had all their game going on. So the main, let's say, the position of the Holy See in the first place had this primary interest of the crusading cause was articulated on two perspectives. Like the first one was keeping an eye on French politics, well knowing that Louis XIV, with whom the papacy could not afford to clash, for many reasons that included the general role of the Catholics, but in practice also the actual military power of the French, and so an anti-French papal policy would have triggered a much bigger fracture in an extremely delicate balance that was about still again making the French acting in favor of the Catholics of Central Europe, not in the sense against them through the Ottomans, right? Would have also never moved in defense of the empire. Like, the French sending an army like to defend Vienna against the Ottomans, like they would have evidently saved the day at the siege of Vienna. There were some helps at some level, but the French, especially at that point, were actually prohibiting even volunteers, as it had happened during the War of Candia, where lots of French had gone to fight together with the Venetians, getting massacred, by the way, but still showing that lots of French noblemen, we've seen it also, Prince Eugene, he fled Paris to exactly go fight for the Habsburgs in Vienna. So there are many obvious connections there that, again, the raison d'etat was bending, if anything, again, as Louis was really a far-sighted sovereign. But in any case, everybody knew that, especially what happened during the 30 Years' War, but historically, right, that the French were rivals with the Habsburgs, and especially now that, as we will see, France was planning a further invasion of the Rhineland, etc. So Louis would have was expected, instead, by the papacy correctly, to profit of any imperial difficulty, right? And also tried to induce the Poles to do the same, because at least he thought that Poland was kind of a French puppet, because of the historical ties also between France and Poland had always been strong in that sense. On the other hand, the Vatican was, let's say, obliged to contain the insistencies of Spanish diplomacy that was alarmed because of the moves of French expansionism, and would have preferred the emperor, instead of, getting too concerned about his southeastern borders, that at the end of the day were principally about the Austrian Habsburgic personal inheritance, were not even part of the empire technically, because Hungary was just another country. That fundamentally nor the Habsburgs nor later even Prussia would have actually built their power in Germany. That was built respectively elsewhere, in other lands, because in Germany it was impossible to centralize or to do anything in the first place without triggering the French and the intervention even of other powers. So the question there from the Spanish perspective was demonstrating to caring, demonstrating how the emperor should have better cared responsibly about his role of sovereign of the Reich, and as such to protect with more energy the Rhineland, right? That objectively was very feebly under imperial control, but which Leopold was still the eminent sovereign, because that was the empire, right? And so there was not much, there was no other way around, in spite of the French were thinking otherwise. Still, there were, as we'll see now, some religious implications that were essentially based on the concept of, what is the emperor doing? These are his lands, and he lets the French expand in them, and especially considering that Germany was full of, half of it was Protestant. So the idea of the French invading France was invading France, invading the empire was based properly on this concept that a Catholic power would have been eradicating Protestant presence. And this is actually what would happen in some instances. For example, when the French would conquer Strasbourg in a few years, and so the local Catholics were actually happy with French presence because it was getting rid of the Protestants in part. Right? Of course, the French supported the Protestants in some instances, but when it was convenient, and some Protestants were definitely very much in favor of the French, right? And of course, they didn't give a damn about religion. Even mostly Catholic Swabians said things like, that he didn't want to pay for maintaining Habsburgic troops. He would have preferred to use Ottoman troops to pay for. That was the actual German feeling about the whole thing, religiously wise. But the same Louis XIV had attempted to invade the United Provinces and taking them over, and that was also the main struggle around the whole thing. So, as you understand, it's all very contingential. So Charles the Second of Spain. So consider at this point it's we're talking still about the Habsburgs, right? Charles would be the last Habsburgic sovereign of Spain. He was the son of Philip IV, and after him there is Philip V, that is, a Bourbon is part of the royal family of France, and everything changed to the point that the Saint Louis would say, "Il n'y a plus de Pyrénées," for obvious reasons. And that was the main problem, because Charles feared that his collaterals of Austria would leave him alone in Europe, right? Alone against the French colossus that was, Spain was a power among powers, but, it was still a massive feat to try to stand France alone. And that's why also the Peace of Nijmegen that had been concluded between, that had engulfed Europe that way, it had mostly been between France and the Netherlands, and there the Spanish had supported the same Protestants, had not reassured him at all, because France was still up to a fight, in any kind of place, and stopping the war in the Netherlands could mean to start it with Spain, and or weakening the Spanish power internationally in other ways, indirectly too. But Innocent the 11th could not calm Charles anyway, because in fact, it was not the papal policy to induce the emperor to follow with greater commitment the problems of the Reich, given that this would have, automatically brought to abandon any hypothetical project of war against the Turk, right? And legitimately, the Habsburgs tended to see their own personal lands as more important than, say, the Rhineland, some of which were also Protestant, that they had been tolerating, but simply because after the 30 Years' War there was no way to take over again Germany. And at the same time, the papacy was not even, in fact, too opposed to the same Rhine expansionism of the Sun King, given again that the same Catholic Germans, as we've seen, were actually happy in part of that, right? Both the princes and public opinion was forming this modern Europe. They felt to be better protected against the Protestants by France than by the empire itself. So Leopold found himself once again in front of very difficult choices to make. Either to accept the intrusion of Kara Mustafa in Hungarian policy, so giving up to a sort of enfeoffment of that land to the same Turks, right, in a way. If not, a sort of properly de facto right of Hungary, of Royal Hungary, to the port, right? Because again, there was no way to hold Ottoman pressure, hadn't all Habsburgic forces being concentrated in Hungary, right? So the idea of pretending at least that the ability of the new Grand Vizier would have been satisfied simply by this thing, and that it would have actually not opened to greater problems was a pious illusion, right? Because at that point Vienna would have simply been next door to the Ottomans, and that was kind of crazy. The way this thing could have happened in theory was the renewal of the Truce of Vaspar that would have granted at that point maybe a temporary stability with the Ottomans, but a very short-term one, in order to run in the western theater of the empire to stamp the offensive of the so-called Chambre de Réunion of Louis XIV that were aimed ideally at, reabsorbing certain lands that even the French royal historians, etc., were trying to see at some point they had been under French control or something like that. It's the late Middle Ages, because this had objectively been going on since the 13th century. And that frontier had always been unstable and quite permeable. Consider Burgundy as a Valois power properly taking over large parts of the empire at that point. So this, again, the Ottomans probably would have not immediately attacked the Habsburgs had they succeeded in securing Hungary completely. But again, this was just simply giving up to them and participating in actually increasing dramatically the problem and the vital threat to Vienna. The other option was instead abandoning the Rhineland to the aggressive projects of the Sun King, and leaving in exchange free to mobilize all imperial forces at his disposal against the Ottomans, with the end properly of adequately coping with the offensive, not just of the Ottomans, but also of their Christian European vassals / allies, starting from the Protestant Hungarians to the Transylvanians, the Moldavians, the Wallachians, right? So consider that this decision was naturally reflected by various, by the situation at the court of Vienna. So, but various factions that played at court, these intrigues, this, generally speaking, also secret meetings that were held by the same Leopold I would listen, right, to many, as we will see, because this party is essentially divided his own counselors and collaborators, right? There was the so-called Spanish one that spurred him to honor, as we've seen, especially his duties of emperor and to safeguard the western borders against France. Then there was the so-called German one, that would be better called Austrian in this context, that exhorted him, vice versa, to think especially to the nucleus of his hereditary possessions and to stop the Turk before that it would be too late, right? And the sovereign literally didn't know what to do, because he couldn't, like all these, definitely, again, in ex post, like we can say, yeah, the Ottoman problem was probably the most important, or at least the one that at that point should have been considered as such, even though there was not an immediate pressure, at least more than the French one on the Rhineland, so they couldn't predict the future, definitely. Now we know how it went. but there was properly a constant pressure, like taking from somewhere was meant to add somewhere else, and it was there were limited resources. Leopold could not underestimate the papal pressure that, given that the same papacy was in difficulty, was indefatigably, again, the role of the papacy here was incredible. It was constantly, rigorously indicating the anti-Ottoman priority, right? Absolutely. This was the first concern. It was, again, a legitimate one. In the meanwhile, there was a firm signal that was coming from Poland. In fact, in June 1678, the King John III had prevented the French ambassador, the Bethune, to pursue in Warsaw the policy of support to the so-called Hungarian discontents, let's say, that essentially meant that Poland was not going to support the Protestant Hungarians, and thus keeping to follow the French policy regarding that, right? Because Poland was making pressure on Royal Hungary as well, right? I made a video last month that was talking exactly about this, that is to say how eventually was the full Polish shift in favor of the Habsburgs, abandoning the French, and seeing how the Ottomans and the French in perspective didn't even kind of attempt to recover Poland, because they gave it for lost at that point. But the point is that the Poles wanted to expand in Central Europe as well. They wanted Royal Hungary for themselves, actually, so that when they arranged the marriage between John's son and Leopold's daughter, the Habsburg princess should have been given in dowry the same Royal Hungary to pass to Poland in that sense. So this meant, this was not actually clear at this point in these previous years, because actually Poland seemed very ambiguous, but we were very ambiguous, and up to that point it had been pro-French. So also the papacy didn't really realize what was going on. Nobody really did, right? Just the French at least thought that Poland was still with them. But this meant actually in a definitive way that for the moment it was irreversible, that the sovereign of the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth had preferred Vienna to Paris. And the peace with the Porte that had been signed in 1678 to confirm actually the agreements at Żurawno 2 years before could not be interpreted anymore as the confirmation of a distensive attitude towards the Ottomans, right? Chosen in function of the advice of French diplomacy, was telling Poland, wait, don't pressure the Ottomans too much, because these have to wreck the Habsburgs. But it was actually in this phase, in these years, simply as a sort of answer, as we're saying before, declaration of safe non-belligerence in the war that had broken out at this point between the Ottoman Empire and Muscovy for the control of the Cossack Atamanate that located on the left bank of the Dnieper River. So Ukraine was a big deal at the time as well, because and until Poltava it would be, because of the role of this steppes powers that was essentially quite autonomous, and at this point nor Poland nor Russia could quite control soundly anymore. But the shift had happened because up to that point, this before the deluge, etc., of which the Ukrainians were also responsible at a point. I made a video about this because at a point there was the possibility of creating an actual, and the Poles themselves were responsible, a Polish-Lithuanian-Ukrainian Commonwealth that would have become like the largest and most sound power ever in the region, and surely could have checked Russian expansionism. Instead, the negotiation between the Poles and the Ukrainians failed at that point, and lots of other things happened in the meanwhile. But let's say, as we know, the Russians struggled actually to maintain, to even seize control of Ukraine. The step was enormous, and there were lots of other issues here, including the Ottomans, who were, in fact, still thinking of being players in the area, right? There was still the Khanate of Crimea. There were lots of kind of prerogatives that the Ottoman sultans to have in the region as well. That's the reason what they had intervened against Poland anyhow, and considered that as Vienna could be threatened, Warsaw could be threatened. It was not so strange, right? Now we think, oh, well, okay, the siege of Vienna is simple, right? It wasn't simple at all, right? It was, from an Ottoman perspective, it was overstretching their possibilities. Like, Vienna was the ultimate reach, right? And it would have changed everything in many ways if conquered, but let's say there was also this main problem of Poland itself that intervened, saying Vienna, and that could be further eroded, especially at this point. But that's why we make this series here, to explain why things took the turn they did. So all this kind of Polish-Ottoman agreement was confirmed in the reunion at the Polish Diet of Grodno between 1678-1679, during which the assembly sanctioned definitely the distancing of the Polish policy from France, and also the instances aiming at reviewing the pacific attitude towards the Ottomans were profiled, in spite of the pacts that had been shortly signed, and that it was, it was without discussion to respect, right? So again, temporarily it was a settlement, but at the same time it was a broader political arrangement to see, in fact, whether that had already decided to support the Habsburgs into this broader policy, which the popes were also interested in. And during the works of that diet that concluded themselves in April of 79, rose, even though in the pretty messed up arguments that were happening there quite fiercely, even voices intended to ask if, in fact, the availability of the European princes to a true and proper new crusade would be, checked. And there were answers to this aimed in that same direction, not just to strengthen the alliance with Leopold of Habsburg, but also to resume the contacts with the Tsar Fyodor III. And regarding this aspect, there was an old issue with the court of Moscow that had to do also with the with papal diplomacy, because the Tsar wanted to see recognized as such by the Westerners that objectively didn't give a damn, together with the title of Majesty and Grand Prince of Muscovy. And this is something, for example, that even Bombisi wrote to Cardinal Cibo, and that still in 1679, for example, both the papacy and Vienna refused to do both, because, who were these Russians? Where the hell did they even come from? And the broader picture here was, however, confirming the choice to abandon and even condemning the Hungarian rebels, right? So at this point, completely reversing the French policy about that had been at that point, also as we've seen, also because of strictly Polish national interest to support them in anti-Habsburgic fashion. So this reveals the breadth of of the Polish scope here, because they were literally thinking in setting up a crusade again, together with the other, with the Western Europeans against the Ottomans. Now, albeit without ever cutting dramatically the contact with the ambassador Bethune, John III didn't compromise himself by contrasting the Diet of Grodno. And so this double play was very clever because it allowed Louis XIV to keep thinking that in some way the Polish sovereign would have ended up to second, or at least not to contrast his own plans, because of course the French had spies everywhere. They knew there was this council, they heard the debates and all these things, but they still didn't think that Sobieski was kind of, Poland was a very peculiar country. The nobility had this huge power, and again, many of them were also pro-French, and so it was not just about what the king thought and said. It was an elective monarchy. The Sun King had bought John's kingship, so it was still seen like, okay, this makes strange things. There are internal debates. It's always the same thing between the monarchy and the nobility, but at the end of the day, they were still keeping in line with us, right? But it wasn't the case, and this ambiguity was very well played against by the Poles, and especially by the king. And the reason to nothing surprising, actually, that not even the papacy was understanding the actual intentions of the King of Poland, in spite of the fact that they were both pursuing at this point the idea of a crusade, and that would have passed through the papacy. The brutally Catholic Poland would have, as we'll see now, also make dramatic effort to show off in Rome with his delegations and so on. So the same Nuncio Martelli, for example, was speaking about the indecision and ambiguity of the Polish king, and nobody really understood, even in the Holy See, what really was going on with Sobieski. In the meanwhile, however, after the Peace of Nijmegen, also at the court of Versailles, some balance had changed, because two high dignitaries, the Colbert de Croissy and Louvois, and Charles Colbert, Marquis of de Croissy, 1629-1696, was the second-born brother of the very famous Colbert, a minister of the Sun King, had managed to, in November 1679, to essentially take out from the political game the Foreign Affairs Ministry, a minister of France, that was Arnaud de Pompon, that had been, in fact, substituted by Colbert. And this was not just like a careerist trip in the power corridors, right? It was de Pompon was quite of a character break. He was a functionary of solid and scrupulous Jansenistic conscience, by the way. So he had quite interesting cultural background, and it was substituted actually by a man whose temper, in terms, say in Schmittian terms, could be defined, without exultations, a decisionist. And so the factions that were agitating in the shade of the throne were surely connected with this coup, but underneath it there was also the change of politics that was counting, right? In fact, France wanted to act just more directly in everything, right? And so this big change, this court earthquake, immediately had consequences in the diplomatic milieu. In Warsaw, the Marquis de Bethune, that had already received by the king a note in which he was being warned of the support to the Hungarian rebels was not so important, was substituted by de Vitry. And in Constantinople, Gabriel Joseph de la Vergne, who was Vicomte de Guilherag, was settled at the place of the Marquis de Nointel. And finally, in Vienna, in October 1680, arrived the Marquis de Sebeville, that, albeit covering, the simple rank of resident, would have essentially carried out the function of ambassador at the imperial court up to 1684. So he led throughout all the siege, the crisis at least of it, because, as you know, the Habsburgs left at some point. In fact, he's the guy, we talk about him, because this is when the Habsburg family was abandoning Vienna with the Tartars who were, skirmishing all around. Literally, they were, traveling along the Danube, and on the other side they found a Tartar squad that was to pass a bridge and could kidnap for the Ottomans the entire Habsburg family. And the Marquis de Sebeville, actually, together with his servants, came out of his coach, brought it kind of a sort of barricade over the bridge, and fenced the Tartar attack off. This is remarkable, right? So these were also kind of men, and considered that everybody hated him at that point at the court, because the French, of course, hadn't sent any kind of help to the Habsburgs concretely, and so he was just the French. But actually, he was a quite interesting and courageous man, and he actually left all this precious story that he wrote about. In fact, we know, thanks to him, lots of details about the siege of Vienna, at least this previous situation before the court left the capital. So the diplomatic cards of the years 1679-80 are particularly important for setting up part of what would have been the stage of at least that found the Ottoman expansion. Like the Grand Vizier Mustafa's aims were ever more warring. So there was also a necessity from the side of the King of Poland to enfranchise himself from the claims of French tutelage, right, on Poland, that were just freezing her fundamentally, while the Ottomans were arriving in Central Europe, and so threatening also the same country. And for, in fact, John III to delineate a grandiose diplomatic military project that received the support of Pope Innocent XI. At some point we'll talk also about this Pope that was excruciatingly important in all this thing, and put together an incredible effort for the anti-Ottoman crusade. And this policy was to resolve once for all the border issues between Poland and the Muscovy that had been left open in the Peace of Andrusov of 1667. Before I said Shurov, no, but those were with the Ottomans. That had nothing to do. This was Andrusov, right? That ceded great areas of eastern, this part of the Commonwealth to Poland, but also the ones with Sweden and Brandenburg for the hegemony over Prussia through the taking over by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth of an active and primary role of a great alliance against the Turk that would have had to really encompass all of Europe to free it once for all from this looming Ottoman threat. The purpose was literally taking over Constantinople, right? And the ultimate goal was also proposed. I mean, even the French in these years had come up with something like that, even essentially making the papacy seeing the possibility of recreating a Latin empire that would have been literally created ruled by the papacy, but as the Holy Roman Empire as a model, and would have given the papacy an enormous power, would have been a major power in contemporary times. But of course, that we'd never know whether that was just an idealistic project. But I mean, the same French had kind of always had this idea still of taking out the Ottomans, and as you know, after starting from the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire existed just because essentially the Westerners didn't decide who would have had to take it over, right? In any case, it's within this context specifically that we observe an impressive set of Polish embassies directed to the emperor and to the Pope, first of all, but then also to the Tsar of Muscovy, to the kings Charles II of Spain and Pedro II of Portugal, to the Elector of Brandenburg, and finally to the same King of France, to the Court of London, and to the Netherlands. And this was a mission entrusted specifically to the noble Możdżyn. And the latter was the treasurer of Poland, and he was actually a sound supporter of France, right? And that tells you how close still, the broader Polish court entourage was to that line. And this is also because he received from Louis XIV a very good pension in the process. So this is also, however, the degree by which the Poles were serious about the stuff and of the crusade, and therefore in Paris people were not happy to hear about this. That is to say, what are the Poles doing, right? These are supposed to be our puppets, and now they start saying that they want to launch a major crusade with all the forces of Christianity directly against the Ottoman Empire, that we're doing as the French every possible thing to strengthen against at least the Habsburgs. Well, and where the Poles would, as we've seen with Royal Hungary, were thought to be particularly active and interested. And it is true, as we've seen with the change at the embassy, let's say of the foreign ministry of France, the same Hungarian policy had been partially abandoned for those intrigues, but let's say this was much bigger, right? And also not really, again, the French were, as we've seen, thinking still that the Poles would just follow what they were doing about that, so even bailing out of Hungary in that sense, on the rebels, from the rebel support at least. And so at the same time, Możdżyn was making known that between Vienna and Warsaw there was a defensive-offensive axis that was essentially committing the Austrians and the Poles to run with one to the help of the other, in case that the Turk had attacked the respectively that let's say that that part that is in fact Upper Hungary, but controlled by the Habsburgs, and that had it been the Polish king to actually carry out preemptive operation, say against the Ottomans, that were threatening, in fact, the same Poland. So again, this showed also how limited Vienna was in theory, just the Poles would have had to rush in her defense, whereas she was expected to participate to the Polish offensive, right? So against the Ottomans. So this tells you how also powerful Poland was in proportion. So this made the French freaking out even more, because it was like an open statement at this point, like, the Poles were the Habsburgs, and yeah, the cause was the Crusade, but like, it would have changed everything, and it was also calling the French to participate to that anti-Ottoman effort. And of course, this was just an ideal purpose. In reality, the Polish commitment served especially to verify once more that the ardor with which normally in political context one abandoned himself to promises and to purposes regarding the crusade corresponded eventually, when, diplomatically things had to be set up, to a systematic, let's call it caution, and a sort of very, skilled art to articulate arguments and reserves, to say, well, yeah, we would like to, but you know what, it costs a bit too much. For example, Spain and Portugal answered the ambassador Piotr Mikolai Korysinski that the Iberian countries were too involved against the Maghrebine Moors. That was a crusade too, to be able to afford the luxury to rush in some way to help to the help of the northeastern brothers. And well, what he could obtain was actually a modest, also a not very quickly sent amount of money. And from his side, the protagonist of the great Polish embassy of 1679, directed to Vienna and to Rome, the Duke Michał Kazimierz Radziwiłł, didn't really please the recipient of his diplomatic mission by exhibiting kind of a haughtiness and an ostentation that at that point especially were not so necessary. Especially the Poles were showing off like the Duke traveled with a huge following, right? And this was aimed because he was hoping to surprise the Romans with this pompous cavalcade, because they were obsessed with the Sarmatism. They had to show these were the great kind of old steppe rulers of once upon a time were coming as great warriors and saving Christendom. But asking during the journey from Vienna to the Eternal City to the authorities of Venice a safe conduct to cross St. Mark's Land, he refused to undergo the necessary sanitary controls, as he was coming from a region that had been cruelly devastated by the plague epidemics. And the same papal government had no intention, in fact, to allow the entrance in the papal states of such a big number of foreigners coming from a contaminated area. And King John was irritated because of the difficulties that were opposing themselves to the arrival ad limina Petri of his ambassador, and also suspecting his pretestuosity, given that probably he didn't trust him that much, was harassing the Nuncio Martelli, with whom entertained regarding this topic a dense, in fact, correspondence with Cardinal Sibbo. So hoping that the papacy would kind of facilitate further the thing, but as we have seen, since Radziwiłł could not cross the Venetian state, he had no other option but to go by ship to Ancona in the Papal State on the Adriatic, and there, as he arrived, declared himself disposed to a brief quarantine, right? But John III from Warsaw insisted for the urgency of the embassy, and he had been even capable of obtaining from his Polish magnates the support of like at least formally to the entrance in a anti-Ottoman league, to which also Muscovy would have taken part. But since the Diet was summoned for January the 8th, 1680, he knew that the refusal of the papacy to welcome the ambassador would have been a sufficient pretext, immediately seized by those noblemen who were actually against the war against the Turk, right? So again, the Szlachta was still in part very opposed also to this new, especially the pro-French one, to the king's decision. And effectively, this Polish nobleman could have made this whole plan crumble. And at stake, there was also the consistent economical aid that had been repeatedly promised by the papacy to Poland. That is not just another secondary issue. In the meanwhile, the Duke Radziwill was kind of growing tired of the situation and was threatening to declare his mission failed and to come back to Poland. In reality, he had no intention to do so, but he knew that this threat would have been a very precious blackmail matter, and in spite of this, the embassy was inconclusive. Among the Italian courts, it was rather the Holy Roman Emperor, also as the sovereign, to send his envoys, and even here with scarce and modest results. And the Caesarian ambassador, Georg Adam Martinitz, gathered less than 30,000 florins from the Lucchese government, other 30,000 thalers from the one of Genoa. Ranuccio II Farnese, Duke of Parma, defiled himself courteously. Victor Amadeus II of Savoy didn't go beyond the concession of a modest sum. Cosimo III of Tuscany sent, in his turn, a bit of money and also a bit of military help, but altogether, you understand, the Italian subjects didn't contribute particularly. So, if you look at this situation at the beginning of the 80s of the 17th century, so the decade of the siege of Vienna, just a few years before, the general situation diplomatically in mostly in Central Europe, also Central Eastern Europe, but overall, right, considering also France, was the one of, let's say, a net of formal treaties in the substantial expectation of a new, unavoidable, and also harsher conflict and war, to which the states of the same western, in fact, part of the continent, the same Italian peninsula, had not really much of an interest in taking part, nor you could really hope in this sense of the renewal of a truce between the Ottomans and the Christians, because at the court of Vienna, many kept counting on it. As we were saying before, they would till the last. Generally speaking, not even the Pope per se was just that thrilled about a direct war or something like that, because at that point was just, containing, kind of wearing out the enemy, infiltrating in various regions, solving diplomatically the situation, which could be possibly done politically. Still, there was war going on, as we'll see now, but especially in Hungary, where the Imperials were still trying to assert firm control in this delicate frontier area. So it's just there is a paradox, but it's so apparently so that would like to think Innocent XI like the best, most effective ally of the Grand Vizier, in, however, claiming that the war should have occurred. Like the aggressive attitude of Kara Mustafa had in fact benefited some generations of actually cautious policy that had been patiently built up by his predecessor. And the same peace of 1678 between the Porte and Warsaw, and eventually the one of 1681 between, in fact, the same Ottomans and Moscow, after a series of Ottoman victories, didn't leave really any doubt regarding the fact that the Sultanian Empire was still, and again, the hegemonic power in this entire immense East European area, right? And that its shadow could actually go as far north as the Dnieper and the upper Danube even. And while Louis XIV was profiting of this state of things to enlarge its domination in Alsace, it would succeed. The Pope and the King of Poland were instead attempting to prepare this war against the Ottomans. So they were seeing it correctly in inside, right? It's just that they were doing it in a way that would provide with some further, let's say, legitimization from the Ottoman side, saying, oh, look at what is actually happening. And in fact, only the Emperor here, the Holy Roman Emperor, was pursuing a position of, doing literally nothing, just waiting and saying, okay, well, we'll see what happens now, and trying to keep in balance. But at the same time, if you want to, and as it would have happened, to resist the Ottoman attack, well, you had to plan these things in advance. And in this sense, the papacy in Poland were kind of more insightful. In the meanwhile, and speaking briefly of this royal Hungarian situation, in fact, things were not going well at all, because there were, in Hungary, the imperial generals Carafa and Caprara. These were field marshals of the Holy Roman Empire. These were both Italians, as you realize from the names. Were famous generals, by the way. But some of them, these especially, were ruthless, right? At least they couldn't really suppress entirely the rebellion, and in exchange they really punished the civilians, because first of all, at that time the troops couldn't be maintained otherwise, and especially in such a wild land that had lost any hope of centralization, especially since the Ottomans had conquered Hungary, etc. So loot, extortions were just obvious at that point. But also because they were right in thinking that was the only way, at some point, with terror, to just not to sympathize with the Ottomans. As obvious as it sounds, of course, this wouldn't, however, bring directly to such effect, quite the contrary at that point, but there were not really many other options. These people were very often supporting the Ottomans, carrying out guerrilla warfare. The imperial forces retaliated and massacred them. So the situation was not definitely a stable one. There were attempts from the local communities to react by appealing to the same emperor, because they saw themselves as still their subject formally, at least to exploit this option. They did so, for example, on April the 18th, 1681, in Debrecen, in a demand in which they were begging, essentially. They said, varis de populationibus pecudumque et pecorum abactionibus victualium denique et innumerabilium bonorum extorsionibus exhaustis. So say, we are exhausted of the various the populations, the killing of the essentially of our chattel, and so essentially the destruction, consequent extraction of supplies, of many properties, and of the extortions at the same time. And so this, not with least harshness that was reaching to the same intimidating level as we've seen, were, let's say, different from the one that the generals used towards the troops, right? These troops were somewhat looking at a devastating reality, and so their mental and physical conditions very often were terrifying. They were terrorized by their same officers, and so it was just a living hell. Like the Hungarian frontier, the Krajina, there was just really one of the single most, traumatically and viciously, impactingly brutal topics in history that can hardly be understood. Like people from both sides essentially scorching themselves or burning themselves alive, eating each other, and this was the kind of normality on the Christian Ottoman frontier, right? So you understand there also why this conflict was so exacerbated and why this was so important also for the same regions and for the same people who lived there, and that were not just, say the Ottomans. Who are the Ottomans? We're talking about Serbs, we're talking about, as we've seen, also Transylvanians, etc. From the other side, you have the same Hungarians living, in fact, from both sides, the Germans around, other Slavs, right? It's a very complicated picture. Now, we will come back on it at some point, but just for saying that this thing was going on from centuries, right? Ever since the Ottomans stepped in. So, well, okay, it's not that the Hungarians before were in very peaceful terms with their neighbors, and especially with the Austrians in general, but let's say it was a different temper reality. It was also the times and the places, right? It's not that elsewhere in the world these things were not happening, but at the same time, the fact it was happening in Europe at that point and so close to civilization, frankly, is quite meaningful about the what really the world was at the time entirely. In any case, for today we stop here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.